Hello guys and welcome to Strategic Command WW2 World at War. Today I'm going to be telling you some advice on what you should do with every major power in the game. I've already made separate guides for what to do at the start as the Allies and the Axis. Today we're going to be talking about the major powers more individually, in case you're playing them individually, because that is an option in this game, or in case you just are stuck on how to properly utilize one of these nations. If you're looking for those grander guides, you can find them in the playlist in the description below, but without any further ado, let's get into it. So, the easiest one is Poland. What should you do as Poland? Well, if you're playing this individually, don't. And if you're playing this in a grander scheme, you die. That's what you do with Poland. You die. You're not keeping Poland alive. You're gonna die. Obviously, put up a fight. Your main goal is to just defend Warsaw for as long as possible. Given that the Germans get to go before you, you may not have the best time of that. But if you can get the strongest possible unit on Warsaw, and maybe around Warsaw in general, holding back the Germans and keep it as reinforced as possible, and the enemies as far away as possible, that is the best you could hope to do. In reality, it's going to take the Germans 2 turns to kill you. If you make it take longer, congratulations, you did a pretty decent job. And that is Poland. Next is France, and France is another nation that is probably just going to die, so I wouldn't recommend playing them individually either. However, in case you are playing them or trying to figure out what to do as them, there's some very important things you need to do here at the beginning. Namely, you need to move, and I've already kind of done this, some of these armies. For example, here, there's armies that are along the Maginot. You need to get them out of there. So you need to send a unit up like so, and then you need to shift and then click on a neighboring unit to swap the army out, and you want to put a corps in its place, because corps can defend the Maginot very well. The Germans aren't going to try to break through as an AI, and a player probably won't either. They're going to go through Belgium. So you need as strong of a defense around Belgium as possible. This is partially reliant on the British sending the BEF. Regardless of that, because we're just looking specifically at France, this means that you want to set up defenses as much as possible on the border where you can defend. Don't get surrounded at Dunkirk, because you will not have any evacuation here, and then especially along the river. The Maginot getting outflanked is not the biggest concern, like if they actually get behind it, because they're rushing Paris, because that's enough to make you surrender. This is where it will be determined, so you want your strongest units here. The Maginot itself can be run by corps. I would recommend not wasting a lot of money on doing any bombing. It's not worth it. Don't even reinforce these bombers, probably. The fighters could be useful, but they are also sort of out of your budget. Making sure your infantry are top of the line is the most important. You can get a free Polish corps, well, free, quote unquote, from an event. I would take that. You can get a engineer as well. That's Spanish volunteers, I think. And that could be useful for setting up defenses by the river. That one is more of a you call. It's usually recommended. I'd say it's a pretty decent idea, especially if you think you can hold out. But for the most part, this one is still tricky to survive as, just like Poland. You will probably die. When it comes to France's navy, I wouldn't recommend reinforcing any of it. It's very expensive, but you can utilize it. Don't get it within range of Italy. That will just mobilize them faster. Rather, take them and probably use them up here, not too close to Berlin, because you will get blown up. Don't go too close to Germany, but use them to try to help form some barricades in place of the Brits, potentially, to assist them, to try to stop the Germans from getting their submarines out into the Atlantic. They're basically just good for human shields. If you're going to die, you're not going to keep them anyway, so you might as well use the Navy for something useful. They won't see any real use other than that before you die. Next, we have the UK. The UK is the first one of these that is very viable to play solo and can be worked into a grander strategy very easily. Now, first and foremost, you definitely want to send the BEF to France to assist them. However, you don't want it to die there. If a corps dies, not the biggest loss, but that army needs to escape. If all 3 of them can escape, that's even better. Holding out over here is great. Maybe, in fact, what you really want is the French setting up a second defensive line by the river. I don't know. There's another river right here as well. And then you could always try to operate those Brits out to a faraway port if you can't force march them to safety, faster than the Germans can catch up, and then just transport them all out. This has some costs associated with it, but the savings by keeping the units alive is valuable. The benefit by keeping France alive for a couple turns longer is extremely valuable. I would definitely do this. Send your Air Force to assist them as well. Just don't get anything killed for it. Do not get too close to Germany in the beginning of the game, because their Air Force will tear your Navy apart. So just don't waste your Navy. Your Navy is huge, but very expensive. You have units in the Gibraltar. You have units in Egypt. You're going to need to worry about defending Egypt once France falls. There will be events to get units over here. I recommend taking every single one of them, essentially, because they are very, very useful. Because you're going to be fighting the Italians and then probably Rommel. Depends who or what you're fighting, but you're probably going to want as much down here as possible to hold off. Eventually, your attention will also be turned to Ethiopia. For that purpose, I would definitely get the South Africans, once they join, headed up there, as well as repurposing the Sudanese for this purpose, and just generally every African force that you can outside of Egypt, I would use to conquer Ethiopia. Go slow and steady. You will take some casualties. It's fine. You're the UK. You make plenty of money, and you'll be getting more from America later via convoy routes. So I would definitely take Ethiopia from the Italians, and then when that's done, you could shift all of those units either to conquering any other issues in Africa you might have, which you probably won't, or sending them up to Egypt. If you are playing more than one nation, I would also recommend including India in your strategy, because India can support the UK quite well by sending some Indian armies and whatnot in to take Ethiopia and then helping with Africa. Historically, this is what they did, so it's a good way to work them into your plans. They can do other things, but we'll talk about India more individually in a bit. Historically as well, there were Australian and potentially New Zealand expeditionary forces that were sent to fight in the desert as well. So you could definitely send them. You don't need them over here for a very long time. However, you will want to protect this region. Not only does it give you some decent MPPs, but Canberra is one of the victory conditions of the game, and you don't want it falling into enemy hands. The Americans can assist you with this, but the Australian local navy is quite limited. It could definitely use some support of the British Navy, which was historically something that came into play. And investing in the region, however, is really a matter of resources. As the UK, you don't have enough resources, especially early on, to invest into every part of your empire. Your focus should initially be France and then Africa after that. If Vichy France is not formed, then you are going to want to get this garrison out of the Gibraltar and replace it with a corps or an army, something that can hold the Gibraltar easier. And you'll want to get the BEF down to Africa in order to defend, because that would be a next target of, for example, a Axis player. It is not the easiest for the Axis to actually invade this region after taking France so early. Like, they'd have to do it at the cost of something else. So getting the full BEF out of France alive and down there if Vichy France is not formed is definitely something that I would recommend. You do have leeway to do research and diplomacy as the UK, because, well, you're not going to die. I mean, an Axis player may still invade you, and this is another reason you want the BEF free. If they make a Vichy France, then they might invade you. So you'll definitely want the BEF defending the mainland. You'll get an event for establishing a home guard. Definitely take it if it's a choice. For some of them it's a choice, for some of them it's not. But it's totally, totally worth it. As for research, it's heavily up to you, because the UK can be used for so many different things. However, all of the long-term text down here at the bottom right, I've made a dedicated research guide, by the way, are pretty good for the UK. if you're going to focus heavily on Africa, you might want to focus land techs, especially for your infantry, and then get those upgrades sent out. If you plan on a navy-heavy strategy, potentially committing the UK's navy to some heavy operations early on, go for that. But you will need definitely some anti-submarine warfare, because those Germans are going to be quite a pain on your supply lines, and getting as much ASW as possible for your ships will be very useful, more so than the other ship things at the beginning of the game. Air bonuses can definitely also help, as well as focusing morale upgrades and command and control. Very, very useful. As for diplomacy, there's nothing I would recommend definitely going for. There is Ireland, but you can seize their ports at the beginning if you really want them. They don't even go to the UK, from what I discovered in a recent PvP. They would go to America, which is strange, so not something I'd recommend. You could try for Finland if you send the expeditionary force, which I would definitely recommend doing if it comes up. If the Russians invade Finland, then there is that very small RNG chance that you can still get the Finns to not join the Germans, and you could get them to join you based on how the events go. If they do go in your favor, then yeah, getting them to join could be useful, although you really have to work it into your strategy. What would this be useful for? Supporting the Russians, maybe, but also they're in a pretty niche location, so you really just want to play the diplomacy probably mostly reactionary. That's one benefit of the Allies, is they can play very, very reactionary. Personally, I would definitely just recommend focusing on your units as the UK. Eventually, you'll be shifting MPPs to the USSR. This is very important. So before then, you want to just use as much on getting your land, navy, and air as strong as is humanly possible, so that you can afford to send more to the USSR, because their survival is paramount to having an effective D-Day and invasion of Italy and the like later in the game. And while those naval invasions are heavily pushed by America, your navy and your units can and will still be important, especially if the fighting in Africa has ceased. So do put some emphasis on your navy, because they could be very handy for supporting the Americans while they're newer to the war and don't have as many ships and whatnot available. Next up, we have India. India is definitely a special one. I question why this one's independent, but it can be played independently if you want to play it solo. You just won't have a lot to do. You have the ability to send MPPs to the UK. That's really up to you if you're playing solo or not. If you're not playing solo, then maybe you do want to do that. If you are playing India and only India, then you definitely just want to hoard that stuff. You have a lot of research going on at the beginning, and maybe all of it is not very useful, and you want to figure this out probably right now. Are you going to use artillery or tanks or even air? If not, you might want to just get half the MPPs back from canceling these and focus in on something that you could focus on, like infantry weapons, because you don't make a lot of money. You do make more than Italy, slightly, but you don't make a lot of money, and you don't start out with anywhere near as many troops. Look at what you have here, nothing. Most of your troops will be given to you by event, some early on, a lot more once Japan gets involved into the war, and you have two main strategies that you can go for here as India. You can either transport yourself westwards to assist the British in taking over Africa, securing that from the Italians, or you can prepare yourself in the long run to go eastwards and play a major role in repelling the Japanese moving into Burma and other British entities here. As India, you are mostly playing a supporting role to the bigger powers, which is why I feel like this one shouldn't be a major, but that's what you're going to be doing. I really wouldn't invest into the Navy. Really pick the thing you want to specialize in. Diplomacy as India is virtually useless, just like Poland and just like France, because, you know, those two are going to die, but you just don't make the MPPs to really afford it. You just want to pick the direction you want to focus on. You could technically do both, but you'll do one, and specifically one, better. No matter what, you will have to defend against the Japs, but you could try to focus everything there in the long run, not lose any MPPs to transportation costs and unnecessary combat, and just focus on one bigger push assuming China gets their butts beat, which they might, especially if you're not controlling them. Speaking of China, this is an interesting one to play. You have a decent amount of income. A lot of it's going to come from events. When it comes to China, you want to strike a balance between being aggressive enough to keep the Japs on their feet, because the more they focus on you, the less they'll be able to handle the Pacific, and the more they'll get dominated by America and the Brits later on. So that's a good thing, especially if you're playing a grander scheme. But even if you're playing solo, that could still be useful to you. When it comes to just pure survival, however, the things you want to focus on are as such. If you can take Haikou and Pakoi early on, you can actually really cripple a little bit the Japanese, because they won't be able to get Indochina for free. This will dramatically stifle their ability to expand westwards. They won't get Thailand for free either. They won't get access to all of the resources in Burma and etc. And you could keep this front pretty much shut off. It's an aggressive and risky thing to go for, but they don't have a lot down here to stop you. So if you can manage it early on, that is definitely very useful. Otherwise, the main thing you're doing is defending and holding your ground. If you can go on the offensive without losing very much, small offensives, not major offensives, like, hey, I could chip away at this unit here because it overextended, especially versus AI, then take it. Because in my experience, versus AI, you can rapidly run into a situation where the AI dramatically overextends and you can turn the offensive. If you're raising the difficulty beyond the standard, or you're going up against a player, then this is far less likely to happen. However, keep an eye out for offenses, but don't commit until you've chipped away at your opponent enough. When it comes to building new units, you definitely want to focus with the Chinese, just like with everything else. There's not a lot of units that you can build to begin with. Anti-air is very, very useful for defending against enemy air, because fighters are really, really expensive to maintain. You could get more later, the Flying Tigers from America, but I wouldn't actually purchase any, even for any min-maxing reasons, to end up with 3 instead of 2. You don't have the money to do this. It's not worth it. Anti-air is a lot cheaper, and it's going to be way better for you for that kind of defense. Heavy artillery can be useful for defense as well, and can be useful on the offense because you don't have the money to afford bombers or anything like that. As a result of all this, actually researching advanced fighters is a questionable tactic. Out of all the planes, this one is the most useful, because you will end up with at least 2, whether you try to or not. However, it is expensive. I would definitely recommend focusing heavily on your infantry early on, as well as your HQs. This alone could be enough to turn the tide against the normal AI, especially if you're soloing. When I was a brand new player, not knowing what I was doing, and not heavily focusing infantry because I just didn't know to, I still managed to turn the tide and actually take Japan as China by 1943. If you focus heavily on infantry and HQs especially, and then later on maybe some anti-air, your artillery weapons if you go for that as well, then you could definitely do even better, especially if you have at least a little bit of experience under your belt in turning the tide. But otherwise, if it goes historically, you're just trying to survive, you might get pushed back, that's fine. A lot of your income is actually back here, surprisingly. So all you need to do is stay alive, distract the Japanese, so that the rest of the allies can win inevitably in the future. That is your goal as China. When it comes to Russia, you better not play this solo unless you have a very strong stomach, because this is the get beat up nation. This is what your playstyle is going to be. If you can invade Finland, is up to you. The main thing is you might get a little bit of territory and a discount on winter clothes. However, you can also get the winter clothes for slightly more money, just slightly. It's not even a lot later on, and then you wouldn't have to deal with the Finns fighting you potentially, but you also wouldn't potentially get them to join you via diplomacy, but there's only a small chance for that to happen. It's a risk versus reward. Having played a lot more of this now, I would actually recommend just not invading. 25 additional MPPs for winter clothes is not a bad thing compared to having to maintain an entire another front with the Finns. You want everything against Germany that you can have. Definitely. And you're going to need to kind of pick your defensive line. The border that you'll have after the invasion of Poland, and I would definitely recommend getting what you can out of Poland, so your border will be around here, is probably not worth protecting too heavily. A lot of units will spawn in there, and they'll be slaughtered. There's not a lot you could do about this. If you do well with other nations, if you're playing them, or if the AI does well, you might not even get invaded by Germany. In my playthrough against the normal AI, I didn't get invaded by Germany because I had distracted them so well in other fronts with the UK. And thus I was able to easily just go from the front and roll into German territory. However, realistically, that was very lucky, potentially, and that might not happen to you. So you want to focus on setting up a defense. This is what you're going to be planning for the entire time. Along the front is not what I would recommend because, again, you'll get slaughtered. You could set up around the marshes because it stretches the front so well. You'll probably be prompted to annex the Baltics. I would also recommend doing that. Finding a position like this river by the swamp is definitely a good place if you want a very firm defense. But don't be too static. Don't let them just push up against that and only that, because you might lose your entire army with no time to recover. Definitely, I would recommend setting up some partial defenses that you're willing to give up. For example, Minsk is kind of ahead of that line in a way, unless you're going to defend along this river, which would be very difficult to do, by the way. Set up some things here that can afford to die, that are small, that can distract the Germans, that can pace them out, and that potentially have the ability, especially, to retreat. That is worth it. Don't just give up Minsk and hide behind the marsh and then just pace yourself out, by Riga with this defensive line going down to the Dnieper, down towards the Black Sea. Don't just do that, because you're going to give up a lot of territory for free that you don't want to. Things may die, but that's okay. You should be getting MPPs from America. You should be getting MPPs from the UK, and you do have a lot of MPPs yourself, especially when you hit 100% mobilization, you get into the war. The USSR is quite a formidable force. You just have to focus on the right things. And then, of course, the final line of defense would be pushing back. You do want to try to hold on to Sevastopol. It could hold on fairly well. This corps is fairly efficient at defending it. I don't know if you want to commit anything larger. Your navy is an afterthought. I wouldn't invest into your navy much at all. There's really not a lot that you could get out of it when you need as much into your land power as possible. Maybe into some ASW for the Norwegian Sea to protect your income, but the UK can handle that, realistically. While Moscow is important to protect, and you do want to protect it in a worst case scenario, as well as Leningrad, this whole region that I'm circling right now combined is not nearly as important as this region right here. The Caucasus has a lot of oil, a lot of income that will help you replace any losses sustained. Even if you lose your capital and a lot of morale, it's going to move to Perm, it's going to move to Kubyshev, giving you more lines of defense. Holding Stalingrad can help you defend here, but definitely defending the Caucasus one way or another. Use this river, whatever you need, Sevastopol, doesn't matter. The mountains itself, whatever you need to. You need to defend the Caucasus, because they could push through Kubyshev, and they still haven't taken enough to make up for if you lose the Caucasus. It's just that valuable in your hands, and very valuable in the Germans' hands against you. Because not only, look at this, 30, 60, 90, 120 MPPs just from this oil alone, not even accounting for what you get from the towns, which adds up to being even more as well. Imagine if the Germans had that to throw against you. You don't want to imagine it. It's not good. So definitely, this is one of your most important things you want to protect. Your industry and mines from Ukraine can be moved to, well, back here. This is why a lot of it's not doing anything right now, all these mines. You have to do an event to actually move the production back here. And it's definitely worth it, because you're probably not going to hold Ukraine unless you get lucky like I did. Russia can do diplomacy, but I wouldn't recommend it. You might be tempted to go for Mongolia because they're so close to joining you, but really I wouldn't recommend it. If you ever do it, it may only be useful later in the game if China gets dominated and you're going to turn Russia against Japan. You do want as many of your eastern units over to the west. Japan is not very likely to attack you. If it's a player, they might. The AI almost certainly will not. So you just want a full Western focus with Russia and turn east later, as is historical diplomacy. Not really worth it. As for research, again, focus heavily on the long-term techs, your morale, your HQs, but especially infantry weapons, tanks, especially tanks for the USSR. Very useful. You want all of these land-focused things, and then air can be useful after that. Just ignore the Navy entirely. And then get used to buying units, because you're going to need to buy back a lot of your units, because a lot of them will die if you don't get lucky like I did. So definitely get used to just cycling through units. The final major on the Allied side is America. And America's going to have a quiet game until 1941. You have to think in the long term. You share research with a lot of nations, so going very research heavy early on and researching basically everything is fairly worthwhile. But if you do want to kind of play a shorter term approach, you can separate stuff out of research. You won't be able to do diplomacy until you get into the war. And plan for whatever front you plan to focus on if you have a focus. You could go Pacific heavy, you could go Germans first, or you could go half and half. It is a lot easier to do half and half, because a lot of what needs to happen in the Pacific is naval and special forces invading islands. Resultingly, all the armies and corps you get won't be able to do very much. You could send them to try to defend Australia if that becomes a problem, but it probably won't be. A lot of the other units will just be busy, so your main armies and whatnot should probably be split. So a half and half approach to allow you to invade, because it's still a naval invasion, but these forces are better off for it because there's not as much in terms of ships or defenses to worry about in this region. An Operation Torch to help the Brits wipe out just Africa in general and set up an invasion of Italy, and then for a D-Day later on could be useful. Or when they do join, you could go for a diplomacy route to get Portugal to join on your side. You could potentially invade through Spain, or maybe get them to join you, though that is harder to actually get a land-based invasion through that. I've seen that happen. That does work. It is a functional plan. However, D-Day is probably a better plan. However, if you could potentially hold Greece, which is more of a UK thing, it's risky. I've done it. But if you could hold Greece, then the Americans could just get in through that way and through Italy in general, and then you won't even need a D-Day. As America, your diplomacy is worth more than others. So you want to be diploing more than anybody, but a lot of the Americas will join you for free. You maybe need to worry a little bit about like Argentina swapping, depending on what decisions the UK picks. But this should be a non-issue, and you should just be projecting your power. Definitely anything you could do as America to give something to another power, I would do it. Because while America has all the money and can rival the Axis by themselves in the long term, you still need to pay a transport fee or a long-range amphibious transport fee just to get your units from America to anywhere else, which makes you less efficient. If you give money to China in any event, do it. If you could give money to the UK, do it. Max out your convoys. Anything you could give to somebody else is good. There really isn't a focus for America. You want to be doing everything, because again, you're going to earn what the Axis earns combined in the long run. And even at peacetime, you'll be doing very, very well. So just be very jack of all trades, because you will be the master of all trades in the long run. You can, again, pick a focus if you want to. That focus is easier to make Europe than it is Japan, due to just the way this is set up. If you do want to focus Japan first, what you're actually going to want is more special forces for naval invasions. You're going to want as many of these as possible. And you're going to want as big of a navy as possible if you want to hyper-focus on Japan, because that's what you need to effectively use long-range amphibious transports and defend them to dominate the Pacific. If the Pacific is your focus, then you'll need a specialized playstyle. Still, you'll have more money than you know what to do with, so still branch out in everything you are researching, especially because you share research with the other nations. And that is every major of the Allies. Now let's talk about the Axis. Since we were just talking about America, let's talk about Japan. Japan is a very challenging nation. It's very fun. It's a very good one to play solo, especially because you're not really reliant on what happens in Europe. If you do have the assistance of others for diplomacy, I would definitely go for the DEI. Diplo them to your side, because then when the American oil embargo hits, it won't actually hit financially. It will just hit in terms of your morale. You will need to fight America eventually. You will need to. So you have to plan for that. You don't have a choice. This isn't remotely realistic where there's any way to avoid it. The Americans are guaranteed to enter the war no matter what, and they will fight you. Therefore, you need to make sure not to invest into China too much. And I have learned from experience that too much means any amount, really. Anything that you put into China is going to slow you down in terms of your Pacific ambition. So you need to figure this out. China has a lot of units. They are very expensive to get through, to occupy, to maintain. You're going to need constant production of garrisons in order to deal with all the partisans that this place has. This is in addition to the early game, where you have to keep enough units here for the USSR to not enter the war too early. And you definitely don't want them entering the war too early. That's bad for Germany, it's bad for you. Now, it is reasonable to shift these units out with garrisons that are already available or that you make. You're going to need a lot of garrisons no matter what. This early investment into garrisons is definitely useful. But don't wait until 1940-41 to get started on some investment into some other things. You know, you're going to need a strong navy. Purchasing new navy is going to be difficult, but at least getting the research going on your navy is very, very important, because you're going to be going up against a navy that could spit out units faster than you can kill them, whereas you'll barely have the MPPs to replace your own. Protecting your carriers is of vital importance, so pumping out escorts is a cheap way to bolster your navy. Your special forces for naval operations will just be handed to you for free later on by events, so you don't have to worry about that. The ships you do have to worry about. Planning what to invade and when is important. Definitely go for the Philippines. Definitely go for the DEI if you don't diplo them. Australia is a must. The earlier you can get it, the better, because that is an objective for a decisive victory. And you will probably be the one responsible for India, but that can be saved for later. That is easier to deal with, because once China falls, you have a better time of it. But an earlier investment into naval assets and any air power to support your campaign there, or any additional ships, which again, I would focus on escorts more, is very useful. It may put off China, but China's not that strong. Some focus on China can be valuable. For example, you want to take and hold Pakoi. Do not let them get Pakoi, because holding this in Haikou will let you get Indochina by event, and thus you'll get Thailand for free, allowing you to get the resources of Burma and Malaya via invasion. And so pushing up to owning the border with Hanoi could be very, very useful as a result. Also because it will stop them from ever getting the Hanoi-Kunming Railroad ever again. This is very good for lowering the amount of MPPs that the Chinese have and increasing the amount that the Americans have to spend. So that is very useful. Unifying your border and getting the railway can also be very useful. A full-on push past Chongqing, by that point you've already invested so much, it is going to slow you down. Unfortunately, is the truth. As it stands, Japan, by the time they were at war with America, did not push this far. They did not get this far. And it would not be unreasonable to not get that far yourself. However, I could understand the reason why you might want to. Chongqing is an admirable goal. Going for Lanchao is definitely pushing it before America enters the war. You will definitely want to go full throttle on Navy if you've gotten as far as Chongqing. You do want to be careful. Don't trade too many losses. Efficiency here is key. You want to bleed the Chinese away over time. Train up your Air Force. Get more Air Force if you can, because that could be versatile to you later on. In fact, getting maritime bombers, which would be useless here, is a very cheap thing that could help you in the long run. It is a balancing act, and depending on your exact goals and the orders where you want to handle things, I can't fully recommend what you should go for, but that's why I'm throwing every potential possibility out here. You cannot do everything. You have to do trade-offs. You can't even really pick a specialization because you're forced into war with China anyway, and you'll be forced into war with America. So you have to pick trade-offs. The Germans are not coming to help you. The Italians are not coming to help you. You are by yourself. This is an incredible nation to play solo, and it is challenging. There is no way you have the MPPs to fight everybody at once, which makes it all the more imperative that you manage them wisely, following those kinds of tips that I have outlined in order to, well, pull it off anyway. Next is Germany, which is definitely the easiest and most money-laden Axis nation to play out of all of them. Plus, you have Italy to help you, and even if it's AI controlled, they will be helpful to you. Maybe more of a burden, really, but still, their units will help you. First and foremost, you'll want to wrap up Warsaw, ideally in 2 turns. For that, just focus on blitzing. There's several ways to do this. I've kind of shown off some of how you could do it in my playthroughs and other guides, but wiping out Warsaw is of utmost importance. In terms of research, your investment into your submarines is very important. Your naval weaponry arguably is not very important, as the Germans. Artillery is also questionable. Going heavily into your infantry and tanks is very important, and your air, as well as your long-term capabilities, your HQs, and your morale. Amphibious warfare, stuff like that can be put off till later. Rocket weapons can be useful, but only if you know how to use them correctly, and especially if you plan on engaging in a battle for Britain. I've learned since my unit guide that you can actually use them pretty effectively to completely wipe out supply in a couple of British locations permanently for the war, for example, if you do invest into buying all 3 of them and or pair them with some strategic bombers. However, that is a heavy investment that personally I would recommend instead focusing into your land force, because if you can take Poland, France, I would say form Vichy France, and then go all in on Russia, then that would be very good. Once you get to the Caucasus, you might be unstoppable. If you can conquer Russia in fast order, which against an AI Russia would be potentially a lot easier, especially with the assistance of your coalition Axis forces that will probably join you, that is very, very good. As for diplomacy, Yugoslavia would be very useful to Diplo. They're already leaning towards you so much. It would probably be the single most useful Diplo you can do, because it will make you avoid having to attack them and go through them to then assist the Italians in Greece, as Greece can be a huge problem when it comes to distracting the Germans. Hell, you could have the Yugoslavs go and handle that for you. Other than that, Turkey is a very, very useful one to go for, because it gives you another route not only just into the Caucasus, but also into the Middle East, where there's a bunch of British oil that you could take away from the Allies and put to work for you that is not going to be very well defended. It would also give you the opportunity to maybe even look at a German invasion of India, but certainly to help dominate Egypt and Africa from a different direction. These are both very useful, however, they will take money away from other potential things, such as investment into your navy, such as an investment into killing the USSR as quick as possible. They can be used to support these goals, but they will cost a lot to get there. They will come at the expense of something. You do want to spam as many submarines into attacking enemy convoys as possible. You'll get access to some Spanish ports that you can use. Use these as wisely as possible, and just try not to get killed. You'll be able to take Denmark and Norway. This will definitely help you in terms of ports. Definitely go for those invasions for free, because doing them manually is such a pain in the ass. The price you pay to do these for free, quote unquote, via the event is definitely worth it. It will help secure your supply lines against a probably aggressive British AI. I would definitely recommend doing this. You'll probably end up with Finland on your side. They are useful for distracting the USSR. Sending them an artillery unit could be of help to them. I've tried it. It works very well. Gives them a lot more leeway and power to do stuff, so getting an artillery to send them, probably pretty useful. You can get Rommel. I would definitely recommend spawning him no matter what. What you get for what you pay is definitely worth it. Now, whether you send that to Italy, Africa, to help them is up to you. If it's an AI, you might want to, because they'll probably need the help. If it's not an AI, then you might want to instead put it into going after the USSR, because every little bit helps when it comes to killing them. And if you can kill them, then you'll probably get to a point where you at least cannot be defeated. Maybe you won't pull off a decisive victory taking London, who knows? But at the very least, if you have the USSR, all the money, you won't be defeated, almost certainly. So that should be your primary goal. If you don't want to focus that heavily, you could also instead focus on taking Paris, and then you could go for Vichy France, and then do a naval invasion immediately to take the UK. This is an effective strategy. You will have to still go to the USSR later. If you're going to do this, I wouldn't go too heavy into Diplo like anywhere. You need to focus everything you have on this. Paratroopers and what troops you have in amphibious transports along France will be necessary. Get those ships ready to go, potentially upgraded, and use your submarines and those ships as human shields, essentially, to allow you to actually land. It is possible. It is doable. It's not easy, and it's a lot riskier than just focusing on the USSR, but it is doable. And if you do take this, then you will have a very secure western border with the ocean and with the Allies, thus making a D-Day nearly impossible and something you don't really have to worry about. You'll get some decent MPPs as well, and you'll put the UK into kind of a useless status. It's definitely worth considering as a strategy, separate to my preferred kill the USSR as soon as possible strategy. Separate to that, you could even go no Vichy France and go to conquer Africa as soon as possible. This would put off the danger of an Operation Torch, and you'd get more MPPs from France. However, you'd still have to worry about the UK and the USSR even more so with this strategy, but it definitely is possible. And in fact, I would more recommend it if you're also playing Italy at the same time, because you could have the Italians get ready for this while you're still working on other things. And in fact, moving units the moment Italy's in the war to assist them in this may be useful, especially if you are doing this solo, only Germany. This is probably worse of a plan, I would say, than the Operation Sea Lion into the UK. But if you do this plan instead, then you are very likely to get Spain to join you. So you'd have a very safe western border still, which would allow you to also get the Gibraltar and thus control the Mediterranean entirely, which is very valuable in itself, but it would be at the expense of other things still. Still very viable, and that's why I would put it there as an option of something that you could do. And that's essentially Germany. Italy is almost a footnote. They start out with a lot of units, but they have less income than India in the long run. Personally, my advice with Italy, if you're playing them solo, is to just focus on making yourself useful, because you're kind of in a France position. You can't be essentially like very useful. You will want some units around the west to go into France a little bit, but you're not really going to take very much. Taking over France as Italy playing solo would fuck over the Germans, but would give you some bonuses. So I wouldn't really recommend it. I wouldn't recommend taking much of anything in mainland Europe with them, in fact. Going into Greece is viable if you could focus on it. If you could get Greece, that could be useful to you. If you really want to go Italy strong, then maybe try to snipe this from the Germans, especially if you're playing solo. If you're playing with the Germans as well, if you're controlling them, then maybe you don't want to do that, because those resources are better in the hands of the Germans anyway. But a solo Italy could definitely benefit from sniping as much of this as possible, just to make themselves stronger. However, if you're just focusing on making yourself useful, I would definitely focus on getting as much of your units down into Africa as possible, because against an AI, you can definitely slaughter the British down here. You can. I've done it. And then you could conquer all of this. So if you don't snipe anything so that the Germans can stay strong, maybe you go for Greece, maybe you don't. It's really up to you if you want the bonuses from it, and if you want the headache, and if you want to give Germany the headache, it's really up to you. Sending all of your units, as much as possible, that can fight, maybe not garrisons, right, down to Africa could allow you to conquer Egypt by yourself, and you could be the one conquering the Middle East, getting all of this oil, which could be very, very useful for you, especially if you're playing solo, and all of Africa taking the colonial holdings. It might actually allow you to build up to something that could be a formidable force to counter an Operation Sea Lion, which will happen against an AI, and maybe even just become formidable in general, being able to strike back in some way. Your main goal as Italy is survival, but if you do succeed well in Egypt and then open your capabilities, then you have a lot of good potential ahead of you. In terms of research early on, I would really only focus on like infantry. This long-range aircraft is hardly worth it. Ground attack, can it be useful? Yes, but it's not very good. Infantry weapons and infantry warfare, command and control, these are your first and foremost like things you need to focus, because that's what you're going to be throwing into here is infantry. And if you can upgrade these, all the better. I would recommend doing it. It's vital, in fact, to the strategy that I have just laid out. And if you succeed in this strategy, then you can do very well as Italy at the detriment of no one. Nobody will be detrimented by this. And then if you have all this money and power, then you could easily turn away an Operation Torch. If you could turn away Operation Torch, you don't really have to worry about an invasion on your mainland as much. Still, keep it defended at least somewhat. Diplomacy, as Italy is only really good in support of somebody else, you don't have the money to be putting into diplomacy. Just like you don't have the money to even max out your research queue. You have a lot of potential research, but until later in the game, if you're very successful with the plan that I just laid out, that's the only time you'd really get to use it, because it's just too much. Purchasing units early on as Italy is questionable. You don't need a whole lot. You start out with so much already. Just keeping what you have alive is probably your main concern. Investing into your navy early is questionable. The Germans will probably accomplish everything that you need to accomplish. It's mostly useful in support, but you know, you're not going to turn away an Operation Torch with your navy. Only later on would you really benefit from the navy once you have the money of Africa and the Middle East. So that's really the main strategy I would recommend. Otherwise, you're just playing support, right? If you are playing with Germany, then potentially using them to help with the USSR could be useful. But I think Italy's main purpose is in Africa and thus potentially the Middle East. Also, maybe defending themselves if you're playing solo, especially. And that is every nation. That is a really long guide. I've made those starting guides, but I wanted to give you a more solo or potentially cooperative look at how you could actually play every single nation, because I know personally, I actually find this game more fun playing one nation at a time, even though that's clearly not how it was designed to be played. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you have any ideas for any other videos, please leave that in the comments below. Again, I do have the playlist in the description below where all my other guides happily exist, waiting for you to view them. For now, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.